Hi and welcome to episode 2 of Holistic Stroke Solutions, where we go beyond conventional protocols and dive deep into the missing links and loose ends of stroke rehabilitation. My name is Kuipers, a clinician and neuroscientist with a special interest in stroke rehabilitation, and I do this together with Linda Radestad, a stroke survivor herself, author and inventor. In today's episode, we're going to dive into the foundations of stroke rehabilitation, and I try to paint a picture where you understand better how we can approach stroke rehabilitation in a more holistic way, in a much broader way than conventionally is done. So, where do we start? We're going to discuss how the nervous system develops, how the brain is built up. In that way, you understand when a stroke happens, what happens to the brain, not just to the area that's damaged, but to the whole brain, and also how it affects connectivity and synchronization in physical functions, meaning especially arm, speech, and the legs, walking, whole body movements. So where do we start? Well, we go back to when you were born. When you were born, you were a set of primitive reflexes, random movements that are already built into the central nervous system. And these random movement patterns, your first movement patterns, they are already there when you're in the womb. And when you're born, they provide the basis on which more and more complex movement builds. Studies show that already before you're born, you're going through a series of movement patterns that create later on in gestation more and more complex movements. So when you're born, you have primitive reflexes that already evolved from earlier primitive reflexes. Interestingly enough, the birth processes in itself creates evolution in these primitive reflexes. So the way you are born is actually helping the development of your motoric activities after birth. So why, when we focus on stroke, is the knowledge of neurodevelopment, how the nervous system builds and how movements build, so important? Well, before I'm going to explain how your brain builds during life, it's very important to realize that after a stroke, we go back and regress in function of the motoric system. You already know that because you're experiencing it firsthand, or you're a caretaker and see it on a daily basis. Why this is important is because we can make use of this knowledge to build a more comprehensive rehabilitation sequence training program that will aid broader than just focusing on the lost function alone. And this brings me to a very important point. To put things into perspective, modern rehabilitation is built merely on protocols that have been proven, protocols that mainly focus, and forgive me if I'm wrong, mainly focus on correcting missed function, for example, arm function, leg function, and really focusing on reconnecting the lost brain controls, whether that's the cerebellum, the little brain, whether that's higher cortical function, the middle cerebral artery territory, which leads to hemiparesis, hemiparalysis, spasticity, loss of arm, leg function, sometimes loss of speech when it's like a left brain that's involved unless your brain is switched. This is in many cases has resulted in very good progress after rehabilitation, although research shows that a more comprehensive outlook on what we can do for lost function is a better approach and is in many cases the more superior approach. What do I mean with this? Now we go back to when you were born. You had a set of primitive reflexes, you had random movement on the back, You evolve through these movements, you build up the brainstem. The brainstem is where all your vital controls, vital functions that rule your organs, your breathing, gut function, where balance resides, where you regulate automated movement patterns. And this is very important in future episodes, where you will see that the brainstem is usually preserved after most strokes, can play a vital role in relearning movement patterns. It's actually a place where a lot of the relearning after movement loss takes place. So we build up the brainstem from these primitive movements, and these primitive movements become more and more complex when you interact with your environment in a more and more complex way. Just think of a baby that's born. There's no precision in the movement, but while you develop from on the back with random movements to more precise movements where you interact with your environment, you start to reach, you start to roll, you roll onto your stomach, you start to prop up your head. The primitive reflexes are replaced by more controlled motoric activities, for example, basic postural patterns where you can hold a position if you want to reach out, for example, or eventually you can roll, start to crawl, and then after that you start to prop yourself up, sit, and you can move sideways while sitting. Later you start to move along furniture, along the wall, in a very careful way, and then in the end you're ready, you have built up core stability through all these movement progresses, and you can start to walk. But this takes many steps, and all these steps are important. No matter what people say, all these stages are important. If you miss these stages, there are missing links, there are weaknesses in your motoric development, which of course you can compensate, especially when you develop higher brain function. The higher brain function, the cortices that develop, they start to control, for example, the fine motorics of the hands, to a lesser extent the feet. So these progresses through movement are extremely important, and we should keep these in mind when we are looking at rehabilitation after a stroke. We know, for example, from research, and everything that is being said in this episode you will find back in the text below with reference to all the references that have been used for this episode. None of what I share with you is just my clinical observation. If that's so, I will tell you. And in fact, everything that I tell you I've observed in the patients that I've seen throughout the years as well. That's why I want to share this with you, because I know how meaningful it is to go beyond the narrow outlook on just the damaged area and the resultant loss of function. So when we go through development and we go through all these stages that I just mentioned, we build up the brainstem, we build up the lower brainstem parts where most of the vital functions reside. We build up the middle brainstem part, the pons and the connections to the cerebellum, the little brain, which is the ultimate integrator of the nervous system, where everything is compared, predicted and controlled. These parts have an incredibly important role in the activation of arousal of higher brain functions, in a cross communication with the higher brain functions, and can later be used in rehabilitation when we miss parts in the higher brain functions. This is important aspect where we use different parts of the nervous system that have not been affected by your stroke to indirectly affect the affected part of your brain after a stroke. So we have multiple ways to address the damaged areas, not just directly, which is the main focus of general rehabilitation protocol, but also indirectly. Now, when the brain develops, we develop from the bottom up. We move our body, the feedback from our body, which is one of the biggest inputs of your brain, if not the biggest input, is the most important. So when you lose movement function after a stroke, you also deprive your brain of the biggest input that is there, that is movement. So when you get spasticity on one side, you lose function. It's not increased function, it's loss of function, because normally the spasticity is not there or the flaccidity is not there because the brain regulates the muscle tone either up or down. This development is vital. If we look at rehabilitation, we can use this integration of movement and reconstruct it, so we not only directly have to increase brain function in the damaged areas, but we can start to reconstruct whole body movements like we did when we were a baby and a little child, going through all these different stages and reconstruct all the different stages in development and all the different movement parts, whether that's crawling, whether that's random movement on the back, whether that is crawling on the belly, whether that's crawling on the hands and the feet, whether that's rolling over, whether that is stimulating the vestibular, the balance system, reconstructing balance in a proper way. These are the most important inputs, and they are used in normal brain function to create a base level activity in the brain that is lost after a stroke. Now we come to the second part. So remember, we have this developmental hierarchy, and we know from research, and you can look this up in the papers that I provided below this video, or the link to these papers, that this hierarchical approach, if you lose, for example, hand function or foot function, if you don't take into consideration, then when we lose the higher control from the frontal cortices, the primary motor areas, that will have a huge effect on the reappearance of these primitive movements. So we start to see that we get a fragmented build-up of motor function. So primitive reflex, primitive motor function reappears. Just look at how you move after a stroke. And then you see, if we don't reconstruct the proper input from whole body movements, like crawling, like rolling, which precedes walking, swimming movements, then we miss out on a big part of the rehabilitation, because then we are going to isolate the lost function in the arm and leg and don't see it in the whole of whole body movements. And that is how our body is constructed. We move on both sides. This movement on both sides not only creates the development of the cortices and the cross communication through the corpus callosum, but it also ensures that we have a basic input on which all the other brain function, arousal, the ability to connect different brain areas with each other, is built. And you probably know that this is not common practice in the regular rehab protocols, and that's why I'm making you aware of this, that when we start to go into next episodes, we're going to discuss this at length, how you can make use of this information in your daily rehabilitation or training practices, whether that's with your rehab specialist or whether that's on your own. Now that's the first part. The second part is when we lose function in the body, we have spasticity in an arm or a leg. This has huge consequences for the feedback. As I explained before, we need the input from the arm and the leg to also create a proper output to steer the hand or the arm. Now, a lot of the rehab protocols take this into consideration. We have very fancy computer-driven feedback models where we try to recreate the feedback from the arm or the leg to the brain and then have a proper motoric output, so we can regain lost function. But again, that is in isolation. We don't reconnect or synchronize all the physical functions with this lost function in specifically the hand or the foot, and we have to have that first of all. Now, there's another thing, this is the second topic that I want to talk about. That is when one area of the brain is affected by a stroke, whether that's a large infarct, whether it's a small infarct, this will in time and over time affect not just the other side, which increases its function to compensate. It will actually create an imbalance that grows over time unless we address it. And that is one of the reasons why we should continue stroke rehabilitation after the first critical period. And even, of course, everyone is right saying that in the first 6 months you can regain function more easily. But the reality is, and multiple authors agree with this, you can regain function pretty much throughout life. The ability to regain function is not lost after these 6 months. So that's important to keep in mind. And what we have to do, we have to keep rehabilitating, we have to keep training, we have to keep addressing, integrating whole body function, not just for base level function, but also to keep the affected areas intact as much as possible. Because if we keep addressing the areas around the affected area, the premotor, the supplementary motor areas, by doing whole body movements or continue to train the affected parts, we make sure that we don't create an imbalance where the good parts of the brain, being the opposite side that often takes over function, because the nervous system is extremely smart, thinks if I cannot do it in the old way, I take over with the other side. But in fact we create an imbalance that grows over time. And there's another thing that's so-called, and this is a very fancy word, diasthesis. If, for example, the motor areas of one part of the brain are affected, we take down the cerebellum and brainstem on the other side. On the same side, we affect the other cortex. Because of a loss of cross-communication, we make sure that these areas become weaker and they start to, we call this neurological depressed. So they lose function even if they're intact. So this is the reason why we have to keep in the right sequence, in the right hierarchy, in the right build-up, like a pyramid of function. We have to keep addressing this, and we cannot stop after 6 months. And this is also what we typically see, and this is my clinical observation, but luckily more and more recent work shows also that people many years after their stroke just think about speech recovery up to 10, 12, 14, 15 years. You can recover function, but you have to do it in the right sequence, the right build-up, in the right ratio, in the right frequency, intensity, and you have to steer it. The plasticity that everyone is talking about, which is for another episode, is only useful when you guide it in a proper way. You have to do it in the right place, in the right sequence, and in the right frequency and intensity. So this episode built on the foundational principles of neurodevelopment. And all I want you to get out of this episode, other than that we added a lot of extra material under this video, is that you understand there's a build-up in how the nervous system functions. We start with primitive movements, primitive inputs, whole body movements. We affect the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the development of the higher brain function, which we have to recreate after a stroke. And we have to take it into consideration if we want to have a complete, that's a keyword, complete recovery, instead of a partial recovery where we just focus on reclaiming function after a stroke. That's it for this episode. Hope this has been useful, and I would like to see you in the next episode. If you have not subscribed yet, please do so. See you in the next time.